Welcome to the Past Precedent. I'm your host, Herodotus. It's the 31st century BCE and Narmer unites Egypt. What's the date specifically? Historians seem to peg him somewhere between 3150 and 2950 BCE. So I picked the century right in the middle. And for our purposes of building an effective timeline, if you plug in Narmer unites Egypt, 31st century BCE, you'll have your second date. Believe it or not, the Sahara Desert used to be grassy and full of life, and the banks of the Nile River, due to its violent flooding, had few settlers. Then, around 5000 BCE, weather patterns changed, and the Sahara Desert became the desert we know today, and the Nile River began to flood predictably. This predictable flooding changed everything for Egypt. As the Greek historian Herodotus put it, Egypt was the gift of the Nile. When it receded, it left this black silt, enriching the land for cultivation, and its banks became the habitat for wild cattle, ibex, crocodiles, hippopotami, fish, and birds. Along the Nile Valley, there were resources such as stone, copper, gold, flax, and papyrus. And all this was shielded by the natural geographic barriers of the Sahara Desert, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Red Sea. This area was now primed enough and isolated enough to become the first united nation in the world. You might have noticed in my last video I said that Sumer was the first civilization. And it was. But Sumer was a region with a bunch of independent city-states ruled by separate kings. Egypt, on the other hand, was the first region to combine all their settlements, called nomes, into one unified nation with a national identity ruled by a god on earth, the pharaoh. But who was the first pharaoh? Well, as prehistory resolves into history and myth gets tangled with the noble past, we see two major regions of Egypt, Upper and Lower Egypt. And sometime around the 31st century BCE, these two regions are united. Now, most sources say it was Narmer, hence the title of this video, and shown here on the famous Narmer palette. But other historians have considered that these regions were first united by the Scorpion King, as seen here on this mace head, around 32nd century BCE. Still others say it was the pharaoh after Narmer named Aha. And if Aha was not the first, then most seem to agree that he was the first pharaoh grounded in the historical record, but after the more mythical Narmer. Whatever the correct answer is, the conversation about this always seems to start with Narmer, uniting Egypt around the 31st century BCE. Now, we've only been using that name Narmer since the end of the 19th century. The 19th century was an important time for the world's current understanding of ancient Egypt. That's when both hieroglyphs were deciphered and the Narmer palette was found. Up until then, due to the writings of Herodotus and Manetho, Egyptologists called Narmer Menes, and today a lot of historians still think that Menes and Narmer are the same person. On the Narmer palette, we see that Narmer was indeed a conqueror and a uniter. At the top of it, on both sides, it says his name Narmer in hieroglyphs, and the name is inside of a palace, so he's the king. Narmer is about to smite his enemy with a mace, and the god Horus is next to him, represented by this falcon. And we can see he's wearing two different hats. On one side, it's tall and cone-shaped, and on the other side, it's smaller with this little thing sticking out of the back, and he's parading around his vanquished foes. The combination of these two hats represents the union of Upper and Lower Egypt. And this is further confirmed by the two next below that are weaving together or uniting. Now, it's not just this palette that confirms Narmer uniting Egypt, his name comes up in other places too. So when historians and archaeologists assess Narmer's historical place in the context of all the other evidence, he becomes the prime candidate for the first king to unite Egypt. And this palette is important not only for that, but also because it's one of the first instances that showcases ancient Egyptian iconography that will be replicated again and again for the next 3,000 years. For instance, we have the smiting pose. Pharaohs are often depicted in this pose, underscoring that they are mighty conquerors and are larger than life. Another are the two hats. The tall white cone-shaped hat that represents Upper Egypt, and the smaller red hat that represents Lower Egypt. Once Egypt was united, the pharaohs are portrayed wearing these two hats together, symbolizing that he or she rules both regions. And finally is the falcon Horus. Horus is a god, one of about 2,000 Egyptian gods, and the pharaoh is considered to be Horus. Therefore, the pharaoh is God on earth. Unlike Sumerian kings who ruled in favor of the gods, the pharaoh was a god. And if you look closely in Egyptian art throughout the ages, you'll see falcons connected with the pharaohs. This idea that the pharaoh was a god stated that his office could not be challenged without destroying the whole of creation. It was his or her job to maintain divine order, which means that they had to make sure that the Nile flooded predictably, the sun rose in the east and set in the west every single day, and the kingdom was protected from attacks. The first reason why all this is important is the impact of the idea of divine kingship. We see this in Sumer, and now we're seeing it again in Egypt. As Professor Wilkinson put it in regards to Egypt, the promulgation of a belief in a monarch with divine authority was the most significant achievement of Egypt's early rulers. The belief embedded itself in Egyptian consciousness so deeply that it remained the only acceptable form of government for the next 3,000 years. For sheer longevity, this type of monarchy ranks as the greatest political and religious system the world has ever known. So as written history begins, governments that existed at that time were in the form of divine kingships that consisted of multiple gods across the entire ancient Near East. And from this point on, political and religious history unfolds by societies either embracing or reacting to this idea. Now, the second reason why all this is important that also aided in Egypt's belief of divine kingship was divine location, or geography. The predictability of the sun rising, the Nile flooding, and the protection Egypt sustained from its natural barriers solidify the idea of a constant order in Egyptian society. Their religion, government, culture, and longevity all stem from this divine location. If we compare it to Sumer, then we see something different. Sumer's rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates that flowed throughout Mesopotamia, flooded randomly and violently, and even changed route over the course of a few thousand years. So Sumer's gods and culture reflected more of this chaotic nature rather than order. As we begin our march through history, we'll continue to see how geography plays a major role in the character of societies, as well as deciding the winners and losers of history. And a final important observation we can extract from this introduction to Narmer is to recognize all the Greek terms you'll encounter in ancient history and why they're there. The terms menes, hieroglyphs, Nile, Delta, Egypt, nomes, Memphis, obelisk all have Greek roots. Even in Sumer, terms like Mesopotamia, Tigris, Euphrates are all Greek. The historians Herodotus and Manetho, who wrote their histories in Greek, really gave us our earliest surviving accounts of the ancient world, and it became the cornerstone of ancient history until hieroglyphs and cuneiform were deciphered in the 19th century CE. At that point, scholars began to comb through those traditional Greek histories and compare them to writings in the newly deciphered languages of ancient Egyptian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Old Persian, and Sumerian to see if these terms matched up. And surprisingly enough, a lot of it did. So these days, those two Greek historians get a bit more currency to their accounts because enough of what they wrote was corroborated by these decipherments. Not everything, of course, but enough. And right now, scholars are still trying to put it all together. So don't be surprised if every 5 to 10 years you hear something new and exciting about the ancient Near East. So when you're studying the historiography of ancient history, it's helpful to know you're really looking at it through a Greek lens. That's been Latinized by a Roman lens, that's been Anglicized by the English lens, and finally it's all being reintroduced to us in its actual terms due to the recent decipherments of the 19th century. So that's it, our second date, 31st century BCE, Narmer unites Egypt. Only 51 dates to go. If you have any questions or know a lot already, in the comment section, please post anything you think is essential to understanding this century or this topic. If you're adding new information, please cite your sources. I'll be monitoring what's going on, and in my conclusion videos for this project, I'll highlight how we've expanded its historiography and list any questions that seem to be left unanswered. At that point, we'll have a stronger foundation for my next project and all future projects. And of course, if you're an expert and you want to share your knowledge to help guide us, please feel free to join the conversation. Or if you're interested, I'd love to interview you and post it right here. So contact me. If you just found me for the first time and are curious what this is all about, go check out my intro videos to both this project and this channel. And as always, subscribe, like, donate some money to keep this show going, click the notification so you know when the next video is up, and I'll see you then.